Ok, možemo mi da počnemo, pa možda
možda
se
se
pridruži još ljudi, a možda i ne, obzirom da ovi eventi koji su online to prvi put radimo, ne znam kakav će biti odziv uživo. Ovdje ima neka mala publika, vjerovatno i online dobro pronaći link gdje će se pridružiti.
Pa
Ja
dobro.
možda se to
mala ali vrijedno čuje, možda i ne.
ja bih
Ja
vam
bih vam
predstavio
predstavio
danas Ena
Ena
Džemila
Džemila
koja
koja
je
je
machine
machine
learning
learning
inženjer,
inženjer,
trenutno se
trenutno se
nalazi u
nalazi u
Minhenu
Minhenu
i
i
ona će
ona
nam
će nam
danas
danas
pričati o
pričati o
temi
temi
Prophet Library
i
i možda
možda
je
je
vremena da ti
da ti
kažeš malo
kažeš
više o
malo više o
sebi, da
sebi,
se
da se
predstaviš, da
predstaviš, da
kažeš
kažeš
na
na
čemu
čemu
radiš
radiš
i se
se
možda
možda
nalaziš u
nalaziš u
Minhenu.
Minhenu.
Naravno.
I ona će
Zdravo
nam
svima. Ja ću danas
pričati
prezentovati na engleskom jeziku, ali tek sam novopečna dijaspora, tako da slobodno pitanje na bilo kojem jeziku koji vam odgovara, odgovorim na isto. Ja sam softverski inženjer sa također pozadnom u ekonomiji. Završila sam Sarajevo School of Science and Technology prije otprilike godinu i po. Osim toga, radila sam prethodno prvu praksu u Raiffeisen banci, odatle i financijska pozadina, jeli. Potom kao web developer 1-2 godine, te data science, otprilike kojima sam diplomirala pa do trenutnog momenta. Zadnjih 7 mjeseci radim u Minhenu u Machine Learning Reply, koji pripada Reply Holdingu, koji postoji na 63 lokacije u svijetu, i broji oko 14.500 uposlenika. I današnja tema koju ću vam prezentovati je Facebook Profit biblioteka za Python, koja se koristi za predviđanje time series i ponekad za anomaly detection. Sad, prije nego što krenem, samo da provjerim, vidite kad mijenjam slajdove, je li tako? Okay, super. Onda šaltam na engleski. So, hi everyone, as I said, Facebook Profit Library. The format of the presentation that I'm going with is basically a bit about what Facebook Profit actually is, and then just what it consists of, and then taking you through a proper case study on the oil prices model, where I guide you through the data prep, the data modeling, results, backtesting, and also the anomaly detection, which is something that Facebook did not intend their library to be used for, but is absolutely perfect for, including something called the rolling window approach and warm starting a model. And then I'll give a little wrap up, not wanting to overwhelm you guys, just then you can toss your questions at me all you want till the end of our 1 hour segment. So basically, Profit is a Python library made for time series analysis and forecasting. Now, in case you are not familiar with time series, basically it's the form of data that is gathered through time intervals. Now, Profit specifically was designed for something called univariated time series, which means that the data is gathered at fixed intervals. Now, those can be every 5 minutes, every minute, every second, every hour, day, a week, whatever. It has to be a consistent interval between the data points. It consists of 3 segments, basically trend, seasonality, and holiday, which make up the analysis in terms of trend and seasonality are the signal we're trying to receive, and then holiday component takes care of the noise in our data set. Now, to go into a bit more detail, the Facebook Profit is designed in a way that can be used so that it can be used by basically anyone without going too in depth when it comes to the linear regression, the mathematics behind it. Just out of the box solution that's very useful, especially in the business world. So it's like financial data and business data are the primary targets in a way that Meta intended the library to be used for. The trend in the model is set by default to something known as piecewise or segmented linear model. So it's basically the one you would be using if you expect your data set to be pretty linear. So it's like the growth is pretty linear. It doesn't matter in which direction. But then if you know that your model might have, for example, exponential growth that will then smooth out over time or any other variation that's not quite linear, they do provide an additional option of using a logistic growth model that has saturation incorporated, but you need to specify that manually within the method. Now, the second component, seasonality, is probably the coolest one for me personally. Out of the box, you get daily, weekly, and yearly seasonality, which basically you decide upon based on your data model, so based on your data set. To make it a bit less abstract, you would use the daily one if you expect your data to have some seasonality happening, for example, in the morning or in the afternoon. So you have a difference between different hours in the day, and maybe you're gathering data every half an hour or so, or every minute or so. Maybe say a shopping center and how many customers a store will get. Like you expect it to be um, a lot more saturated with individuals, sometimes around the end of work hours, for example, and you expect it to be pretty empty at like 8 a.m. So you would go with the daily one there. Weekly, again, if you expect some trends happening more towards which day of the week it is. Again, with the same example, you would expect it to be a lot more full on the weekends versus work days. And then the yearly one incorporates uh, the largest percentage of use cases, I would say, since with that you can really allow the model to spot any seasonality happening maybe during a specific season, like autumn, spring, or within a specific month, or anything else really. Um, Now, outside of those three out of the box seasonalities that are provided, you can again customize it on your own, but you need to know for your sums and dive a little bit into that. So basically, how you would approach it if you really want to customize it, but most use cases don't really require it, is you would treat per year's order as the speed of seasonality. But you have to be super careful to not overfit the data based on your current knowledge of the data set, because in essence you're adjusting what the model knows based on what you know. You never want to do that. Also, if you're going with the yearly model, it is recommended to go with at least 2 years, ideally 3 years of data for the seasonality method to even be able to catch any seasonality. So if you only have 1 year, it really has nothing to work off of. 2 years is going to be fine, but still a bit overfitted. 3 years or more is just phenomenal. 3 years specifically seems to be a sweet spot for the yearly one, since it has enough data to form the model, but not too much data in terms of it's not going to get confused with something happening, such as, for example, the pandemic, that's going to mess up its expectations, but otherwise it handles outliers quite well. Now, last thing about seasonality, again, it has two components. One is set as default, which would be the additive style of seasonality, which in essence means it expects a linear trend. One you could also use is multiplicative or compounding, which is used again if you expect your data set to be more towards logistic growth or exponential growth or anything compounding in essence. Hence, it's related to the trend type. Now, the final component, the noise component, is the holidays flag. So, as I said, since the library was primarily built for business time series, you know that holidays are something that really impacts your data set. And they provided a built-in flag, basically a Boolean, based on literally which country's data you're working with, um, just so it could clean up the data and not take it into account. So, for example, you wouldn't really care what happens during this at the stock market during Christmas or New Year's because it's really not representative. Mm, Now, this was a lot about Facebook profit, but why is it the actual library I chose for representing time series? Basically, it's very beginner friendly. So another very popular model is Arima, and the thing with Arima is it is customizable, but you need to hand customize it. You need to really take the time to customize it to your own use case because out of the box it only comes with two hyperparameters, which are the past values and past errors. Everything else you need to come up with on your own. Um, but there is one caveat: Arima and other time series models are not as dependent on the actual calendar date as Facebook Profit is. But that is because Facebook Profit basically functions along the lines, okay, we're observing this one specific parameter on the y-axis, and we're observing it throughout a specific time period on the x-axis. So basically, we want to see how the parameter changed over time. While in Rima, again, it's not as clear cut. There isn't a specific use case that that model was developed for. It's more versatile, but it requires a lot more understanding on the technical side to be used. Now, the unintended feature of the library, the anomaly detection, basically people realize that by using the forecasting functionality, they can compare it with the actual values coming in. So basically, what they would do is they would try to predict, okay, what's going to happen at our next data point. So it's, for example, we're gathering data daily. You're trying to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. And then the next day, you come in, you now know what data you gathered, you compare it with the prediction. And depending on how consistent and monotonous your data set should be, you might spot anomalies automatically this way if the actual value that was reported flies way outside of the expected range. So the uh, method, the Facebook profit method, um, has this interval of the value it expects set to about 80%, and it can be adjusted as everything in the model can. But also depending on how far into the future you're looking at, it gets less precise. So basically, if you're looking one day ahead, it's going to give you a pretty short interval of expected values. So it's like it's quite narrow. But if you're looking, for example, like 7 days or 1 month into the future, it becomes less certain. And due to uncertainty, the range of predicted values that it provides is larger at each point. Now, to make it a bit more concrete, the use case I selected is basically oil prices. While oil prices, because we know of two relevant events in history that have significantly impacted the prices of oils. So the data set I collected, well, not collected, downloaded from Kaggle, basically date from 1987. And at the time when I downloaded it, it was November 2022, so that was like the most recent data. Um, Now, the first thing you always do when you look at data is you try to see uh, visually what's happening. And when we look at this diagram, we basically see that there was a sharp drop somewhere at the beginning of 2008. So it can be kind of mapped to the Great Recession that happened in that time period. And then it slowly recovered over time, with, I would say, in 2010, it actually going up again. And then we have another sharp drop in 2016 once the OPEC announced some changes, and the geopolitical events of that time also caused the demand for gas, for car gas to drop significantly. Now, considering the fact that this data set was very much observed during the 2022 um, and the aggression on Ukraine that was conducted, which resulted in sanctions to Russia, which messed up the entire global marketplace for the gas. I figure this would be a very interesting use case to look at. And again, looking at the data set, we see that very sharp drop that happened in 2020 when COVID happened, and then another one uh, when the attacks happened. Now, the data was split into training and testing sets. So one would be before um, before end of 2021, so just at the start of 2022. And also you don't want I didn't want too much of a time frame, so I'm looking at 3 years prior for our seasonality to get trained properly. So 3 years prior, which is start of 2019, and then the entirety of 2022 for testing and predictions. So for clarity, phase of profit kind of hard coded the names of variables that they use in their model and their functions. DS stands for date stamp, and it represents the x-axis. It's always on the x-axis, um, and it's the datetime um, data format. You can have it as date, you can have it as just hours, but it's the stamp basically. And then Y is hard coded for the any variable that you may be using, but you can only use one at a time. It is used for training. And yeah, you could basically allocate those two in the method. Now, when the model and wait, you can see basically how it looks over here in terms of code. When the model does its thing, its little black box estimate, it returns a new data frame with predicted values, the expected range within which the value should belong to, and the seasonality attributes. So they are titled again hard coded as y hat lower and y hat upper, where y hat is the predicted specific point, a specific value of y to be predicted for the next time interval as the next data point, and then y hat lower and upper, the lower and upper uh, limits of the range that the model is anticipating, given how far into the future you're looking at. Um, so the two values tend to be further apart as we look further into the future for obvious reasons. So it's like less certain what's happening there. So now visualization is done with the PyPlot library. It's very clean. It's very easy. They kind of just uh, made it very adaptable, but you can also mix it with Seaborn or any other library that you might prefer. You would just treat it as if it's the PyPlot object. It's very easy. They kind of just made it very adaptable, but you can also mix it with Seaborn or any Alrighty, other so now again to the visuals. Once you actually plot the little data frame that Phase of Profit spews out to you, this is something that you will see. So basically, up until January 1st, 2022, I just denoted the data points in black, so I know that's all data, the one we were training on, and then the blue data is the actual values that the actual price points of Brent oil that are present in the test set. The little squiggly blue line represents the values that the phase of profits model anticipated and predicted for the following time period, and the light blue shaded area is basically the ranges that it predicted it could fall into. So basically, you can see that for I'd say a good month or two, the predictions were actually following the actual data quite closely. Very little discrepancies there. But then over time, since we had this unexpected jump, and this wasn't an anomaly since it kept going up, yeah, the model made a mistake in terms of predicting it in the future. But then again, it kind of normalized, so to say, because the general trend is upward sloping. Um, so this is something that would be very useful to have, but as I said, it reveals a potential use case. So, uh, say that you, for whatever reason, are uh, a business owner that's very closely interested in the um, movement of oil prices. Now, you want to have a way to detect an anomaly in data before it actually happens. How would you do that? So, basically, the day by day approach that I mentioned earlier is something called the rolling window. So basically, you're trying to predict what's going to happen day by day, and you may want to make this a little shaded area bigger or smaller depending on how much variation in your data you're looking for. Now, if something falls out of that range, you can write a method that maybe emails you or flags you in a different way. So you would pay attention to the trends that are happening. But it's worth mentioning that if you do this, the rolling window model will learn of the trend after 3 days. So after 3 days, if the trend line is still going in the same direction, it's going to treat it as no longer an anomaly. Now it's a new trend. So if we did that here, when we started getting the anomalies, it would flag them for about 3 days, and then it would be not detecting any problems with the data up until the third point over here, and then it would be like falling very significantly, very sharply, again sensing it for about 3 days, not registering it, then again up until the following pivot point. Um, so these are some very useful functionalities, but you need to be aware of how they work. Now, this approach is very useful, but it is also very computationally intensive. So one thing that is often done is warm starting the model. Now, what that means is basically you want to have a model you already trained on previous data, somehow memorize whatever it is that it learned, and then to just push in the new data as the rolling window progresses into the pre-existing model. Facebook enabled that, but not already built in. Um, it's enabled it via um, an additional code snippet that you need to copy into your code. They called it the stan init method, and it's basically the one over here from res to return. And you just call it, I'll let you call it within the init parameter, warm start parameters, and then it does the thing. You can find this in their manual pages, in their instruction manuals, very clearly defined, and it's really good for improving speed performances because after a while you just have a huge amount of data. Like imagine recording something every second or every minute, like over 1 month time frame, you're just going to have a huge amount of data. You do not want to be retraining the model every time. Um, but what happens there is it might catch some changes a bit later versus when you're training the whole model on the entirety of the data set once again. So this form starting is best used exclusively with rolling window. Now, those would be the main points and main functionalities that the Facebook Rocket Library provides. It's quite versatile, um, but also quite limiting in terms of um, what your data format should look like if you're going to use it. It is very powerful, very easy to use for a beginner. Um, it is great for data that has outliers. It's great at detecting unexpected behavior. It's less fine-tuning compared to other models. They're quite popular, and it's primarily suitable for finance and research. Now, that is it for my monologue, and I am happy to answer any and all questions that you may have.
Yes, I have some. Just to get closer to get louder. Can you hear it well? Okay, so I'm interested in maybe I didn't catch it. Is Facebook Profit some engine or is it a pre-trained model that you can use
Just to get closer to get louder.
can
Um,
you hear it well? Data and
it is a
okay,
library
so
that provides
I'm
a model
interested
that
in
you will train. but the design of the model, the logic of the model is just that. It's the algorithm behind it, and then you're basically giving it the training data and the testing data, and then it derives the
It is a
forecast based on
library
what it learned
that
from the
provides
training data you
a
provided.
model that you will
Okay,
train.
so it has no
But
previous
the design of the model,
bias.
the logic of the model is just that.
Um,
It's the algorithm
and
behind it,
yeah,
and then you're
anybody
basically
else?
giving it the
Yes.
training data
I have
and the testing
actually
data,
two
and
questions.
then it
First,
derives
did you have a
the
chance to
forecast
use
based on
Facebook
what it
Product
learned
with
from the
the
training data you
data
provided.
that
That you
sits
will
on the
train.
Okay, so it
clouds?
has no
But
previous
Uh,
Maybe
the design of the
AWS,
model, the
Azure,
logic of
or
the model is just
GCP,
that.
uh,
It's the
Azure?
algorithm
Uh,
behind it,
yes, I
and
used
you're
it
anybody
with
basically
else?
giving it the
data
training
that was
data
I have
hosted on
actually two questions.
AWS
First,
S3.
did you have a chance
I
to use
did not
Facebook
personally work
Product
with the
with
infrastructure
the
for that,
data
but
that
basically we
sits
had an
on the
ingestion
clouds?
pipeline that
Maybe
retrieved the data.
AWS, Azure, or
It was also
GCP,
present in
Azure?
MongoDB, and then
Yes,
from
I
MongoDB we
used
would
it with
read it
data that was
into the model. The
hosted
model would
on
consume it,
AWS
spit
S3.
out whatever it needed to,
I did
um,
not
and
personally work with
then
the infrastructure for
uh,
that,
we
but basically
primarily
we had an
used it
ingestion
on the
pipeline that
financial use case
retrieved the data.
for
It
the
was
stock market.
also
We
present in
wanted to see,
MongoDB, and then
since
from
there's something
MongoDB we
that's
would
called splits
read
in
it
finances,
into the model. The model would
the
consume
stock
it,
market. So basically, when a split
spit out
happens,
whatever it
the
needed to.
value
Did not
of a
and then
stock can vary very
we
greatly,
primarily
and
used
that's
it
something that needs to
on
be
the
spotted.
financial
So
use
something
case
that was worth maybe
for the stock
$230
market. We
dollars
wanted to
now
see
suddenly is like
since
five
there's
for
something
whatever
that's
reason,
called
and
splits
it's
in
an important
finances
anomaly that you need to spot.
in
And every
the stock
time that
market. So
there's an
basically, when a
anomaly
split
happening with
happens,
anything
the
in our data
value
set, it would
of
be
a stock
mapped on
can
a graph
vary
uh,
greatly,
and
and that's something that needs to be spotted. So
extrapolated with
something
the
that was worth
expected value,
maybe
actual value,
$230
lower and upper bound,
now suddenly is
and
like
then sent
five
to the
for
stakeholders
whatever
so they can
reason, and
actually
it's an
analyze it with their
important
financial
anomaly that you need to
teams.
spot. And every
And
time
which
that there's an
tool
anomaly
did you use
happening
in
with
that
anything
project?
in our data set,
It
it
was
would be
just like
mapped on
organizing
a
data
graph
from
and
areas.
extrapolated
No,
with the
AWS was just
expected
like we
value,
have
actual
AWS,
value,
we have S3. I
lower and
am
upper
not
bound,
sure
and then
what was
sent to
used
the
for the
stakeholders so
ingestion
they can
pipeline, but
actually
it was
analyze it with
done
their
in
financial
AWS as
teams.
well.
And every time
Which
that there's
It
an
was
anomaly
pushed
happening
to
with
Mongo,
anything in our data
and then
set,
we were just
it
reading from
was
Mongo
like
on the Python
organizing
side.
data. When
uh,
you
and
analyze the data
uh,
and apply
no,
machine learning,
AWS was just like we have
where
AWS,
do
we
you
have
where do
S3.
you
I am not sure
No, no, the
what was
analysis
used
was
for the
done
ingestion
by
pipeline, but
financial
it was done
experts.
in AWS as well.
locally or
It
New
was
York.
pushed to Mongo, and then we were just reading from Mongo
Okay,
on the
well,
They
Python
were
side.
getting reports basically.
when you
I think Kemal was asking about like locally on your system, or did you push your code to some service in
in terms
No, no,
of
AWS
the
for
analysis was done by
occasionally
financial experts.
about?
locally
I
or
have not done nothing
New York.
DevOps related for this specific project, so it's like we just
Okay, well,
triggered the
Reports basically.
emailing service that was
Kemal was
on
asking about
Outlook,
like
I believe.
locally on your
I'm
system,
not
or
even
did you
sure.
push your code to
And it was
some
just like
service
sending the
in
email
terms of
containing all of the data, but I did not do any of the infrastructure bits. That was for
I have
DevOps
not
and
done
Cloud Ops.
nothing DevOps related
okay,
for this
well,
specific project, so it's like we
you said
just
I have a
triggered
question
the
as well.
emailing
I,
service that was
so
on Outlook,
for
I
someone
believe.
who has just
I'm
like
not even sure. And it was just
maybe
like sending
very
the email
fundamental
containing all of the
knowledge of
data, but I did not
data
do any
science,
of the infrastructure bits.
I'm
That was for
curious
DevOps and Cloud
what would
Ops.
be
okay.
the
Specific project, so it's
entry
like we
level
just
approach for
I
someone who
have a
wants to
question as
try the
well.
library?
emailing service
What would they need? You
that was
mentioned there's
on Outlook,
a
I believe.
steep computational
I'm not even
cost,
sure.
operational cost
And it
to
was
play
just
with
like
this
sending the
library.
email containing all of the data, but
You said
I did not
you
do
pulled out
any of the infrastructure bits.
the sample data set that you showed us from Kaggle. I believe that's a platform for data science. You can find more information on their data sets. So let's say I want to try on small sample of financial data. I want to do some financial forecasting for let's say particular stock estimates of a specific category. Let's say semiconductor stocks that are particularly interesting to me lately. What would be your take on like trying to run with that problem at the I guess at the cheapest possible cost, which would be like personal expense or something like that. Uh, would you recommend some cloud service or something like that, or
I think it wouldn't be too necessary since even like with the warm starting, we were working with, I would say, so data was gathered every minute for longer than 3 years. We had 7 years worth of data for financial analysis. We had top
I think it wouldn't be too necessary
3,000
since
even
like
tickets.
with the warm
So
starting, we were
companies that are
working
on
with,
the New York stock
I would
market,
say,
we
so data
had
was
in
gathered every
parallel
minute
the
for
data
longer than
on their
three
price
years.
points, the data on
We had 7 years worth of
the
data for
news related
financial
to the
analysis.
specific
We had
company or any
top, I think it
stakeholder
wouldn't be
or
too
public figure related to
3,000
that said company.
even
We
tickets
had
with the warm
sentiment
starting,
related to the news.
companies
It
that
was
are
just a
on
bunch
the
of
New York stock
parameters and was
market,
still not something that you would
we
feel
had in
as long as you
parallel
use the warm
the
starting
data on their price points, the data on
feature. And
7 years
that's
worth
it.
of
Like your
news
machine,
related
even
to
if
the
it's like a
specific company or
two
any
core,
stakeholder
it's
or
it's going
public
to be
figure
fine.
related to that said
Now,
company.
the approach I
We
would
had
recommend to
sentiment
just
related
make
to the
sure
news. It was
you're
just a bunch of
working
parameters and
optimally
was still
there
not something that you
is
would
basically
feel
okay.
as
You
long as
will
you
filter
use the
out,
warm starting
perhaps you can web
feature.
scrape
And
Yahoo
that's it. Like
Finance.
your
On
machine,
Yahoo
even if
Finance,
it's
you will
like a
filter out. So the industry
two
they belong
core
to is the
it's going to be fine.
semiconductors.
Now,
And
the
then
approach I would
you would
recommend
look at
to
the
just make
data
sure you're
maybe
working
by the
optimally
hour
there
or by every
is
five
basically
minutes
okay. You will filter
for the
out
duration of 3 years for only
perhaps
those
you can web
tickets
scrape Yahoo Finance.
specifically, and you would
On
have the
Yahoo Finance,
model
you will filter out
be
the industry
trained
they
and
belong
then
to is
saved
the
under a specific
semiconductors.
title that includes the name of the
And then
ticket
you
in the
would
name
look at the
for each of
data
them. So you
maybe
would basically have a
by the
separate
hour or
phase of
by
profit
every five
model
minutes
for each
for
stock
the
that you're
duration of
interested
3 years.
in
Perhaps you can
for
web
whatever
scrape
reason. And then
specifically,
when the
and you
new
would
data is
have the
coming in,
model
you could warm start
be
it,
trained
maybe
and then
not even every
saved
time,
under a
but
specific title
maybe
that
once a
includes
day.
the name of the ticket
That
in the
would be
name
fine.
for
So
each of
it's
them.
like at the end of the
So you
day,
would
you have
basically
gathered
have a
maybe
separate
what
phase of profit model for each stock
I'm
that
not
you're
sure, but no
interested
more
in
than 100 data points
for
for
whatever
sure
reason. And
during
then
the time that the
when the
market
new
is
data is
open.
coming in, you could warm
And then
start
you would
it,
warm start
maybe
the
not even
model
every
with
time
this new
under a
incoming
specific
data
but maybe
every
once
time.
a day the name of the ticket
That
in the
would be
name
fine.
for
So
each of
it's
them.
like at the end of the
So
day,
you
you
would
have
basically
gathered
have a
maybe
separate
what
phase of profit model for each
I'm not sure,
Is
but
there
no
any
more than
more
100 data
questions
points
from
for
Beta?
sure during the time that the
when the
market
new
is
data is
open.
coming in.
And then
It's
you would
not yet
warm start the
enough. Nice to
model
see you again.
with this new incoming data
For all of
every
you, I
time.
was working actually
That would be
with
fine. So it's like at the end of the
this
day, you have gathered
ingestion
maybe
pipeline.
what
So just one quick
is there
question.
more than 100 data points
Were there
for sure
any major
During the
changes
time
on
that the
this
market is
library?
open,
Because mine
and then
did
you would
not yet,
warm start
hopefully.
the
Nice to
model
see you again.
with this new incoming
After
data
actually
every
we
time.
work together,
That would be
were
fine.
there any major changes? This
Not to my
ingestion
knowledge.
pipeline.
I have last looked at the
So just
documentation
one quick
in
question.
July. Uh,
Were there
in
any
July,
major changes
uh,
on this
everything was the
because
same
mine
as back when you were under
did not
project.
yet, hopefully. Nice to see you again. After actually we work together.
Maybe some questions from the
Not to my
guests who
knowledge.
are
I have
with
last
us
looked at the
virtually.
Just
documentation
one
in
quick
If
question.
July.
you have some questions,
Uh,
can you
Were there
in
any
either
July,
major
mute
changes
uh,
on this
everything was the
unmute
same
or
as back when
write
you
in
were under
the chat?
project.
Nice to see you again. After actually
Mm,
we work together.
Maybe some
It
seems there are not.
Not
Uh,
to my knowledge.
and I have to say it was interesting to listen for your presentation. It's good to know there are people from Bosnia with such a nuanced knowledge of these topics because these are really niche topics. And if you have time, sometimes when in Sarajevo, some events that we are hosting live, it's good for you to visit to meet with us and to network. And also, we would be really glad to host you also in person here. We wish you all luck with your work and learning and growing. And yeah,
Thank you, will show up happily. Thank you for having me и hvala svima ostalima što ste došli da slušate mene kako trabunjam.
Now, one unofficial part.
Thank you, will show up happily.